Chapter 10. Hunting a Hawk. The Hardys had been following a mysterious dory for some time, when the sluice motor began to sputter and the craft lost way. Joe, seated on the forward deck as lookout, whirled around and asked, "What's the matter?" "Sounds as if we're out of gas," Frank replied. "Impossible," said Joe. "The gauge read full when I checked it at the docks." Frank unscrewed the tank cap and beamed his flashlight inside. "I have news for you, Joe," he said. "It still reads full, but there isn't a drop of gas in the tank." The Hardys examined the gauge and discovered that it was jammed. "This didn't jam itself," Frank declared. "Someone tampered with it." "Someone from the Daisy K?" Joe guessed. By this time, the motor dory was out of sight. In disgust, the boys brought out the emergency fuel can and emptied its contents into the tank. Since there was little hope of locating the dory with their limited gas supply, the Hardys headed for home. While Frank fixed the gauge, they speculated about where the dory had come from. Perhaps from a ship waiting at sea. The boys could see no lights to indicate any vessels, however, and concluded that the dory might be planning to meet a passing ship later. "I wonder who those two men were who climbed aboard the Daisy K," Frank said thoughtfully. Joe shrugged. "I guess our only hope of solving this is to keep the Daisy K's crew under close observation," he commented. "When we get back to town, let's ask one of Dad's operatives to watch them." "Jeff Kane is in town," Frank suggested. When the boys reached Bayport, Frank telephoned the detective. Kane readily agreed to take over the assignment. Early the next morning, after feeding the falcon, the boys took turns phoning the pet shops, which they had not had time to call the day before. This time they were more successful. Two of the owners supplied them with the names of carrier pigeons. Some of these were in Bayport, while others were a distance away. With Frank at the wheel of the convertible, the Hardys started on their quest. The first place was only a half-mile from their home. The pigeon keeper, a young man about 25, proved to be a squabble breeder who kept a few carrier pigeons as a hobby. He showed them to Frank and Joe. "I entered these in the cross-county fair," he said. "My birds have brought me several cups and ribbons," he added, stroking one of the racing fowl. In reply to Frank's question, the young man said that he had never taken the birds out to the waterfront and released them. "In fact, I don't know anyone around here who would do that," he said, "because the contests are always from inland cities to the coast." The Hardys thanked him for the information and went on their way. Both of the others' local men proved to be above suspicion as well. The next name on the list was Reed Newton, who lived about 5 miles away. When Frank and Joe reached his home, they found him to be a retired carpenter in late to middle age, who had flown pigeons as a hobby for many years. He had a large coop and several breeding cages. "You raise more pigeons than you train and fly, don't you, Mr. Newton?" Frank said. "Oh, yes," the man replied. "I sell 'em." He smiled boyishly. "I may sound a bit vain, but my pigeons are becoming known all over the world." "Has anyone purchased a large number of birds recently?" Reed Newton wrinkled his brow for some moments, then replied, "Not recently, but about 2 years ago I had a big order. A young man from India bought a whole flock of pigeons, named Benav. I don't know. "Benav?" Joe exclaimed, but recovered quickly and added, "That's an unusual name." "Can you describe this man?" Frank asked. "Well, I remember he was tall, slender, rather handsome fella, about 25. One thing I particularly remember was a scar at the base of his chin. It stood out clearly because it was slightly lighter shade than the rest of his face." Frank and Joe could hardly believe their good fortune in picking up this clue. Was the Benav who had purchased the pigeons related to the Indian government officer who was now using the name Delhi? After the Hardys left Mr. Newton, they speculated about the name Benav, who had brought the pigeons. "It's possible," said Frank, "that he was an impostor who had been planning the smuggling racket as far back as 2 years ago." "Right. Figuring that if anyone uncovered the plot, the real Benav would be blamed. We must phone Mr. Delhay about this as soon as we get home." The drive to the farm of John Fenswick, the last pigeon farrier on the boys' list, was long. On the way, they stopped at a roadside restaurant to have lunch, when Joe spotted a sign with the name Fenwick on the foot of the lane. He exclaimed, "That's a weird setup for a pigeon farrier." On the lawn, inside a circular fence that lined the property, were several perches. Each of them held a hooded hawk. "Fenwick must be breeding fighter pigeons." Frank grinned as he turned into the drive. A pleasant-looking man in his middle 30s strolled briskly from the backyard. He was dressed in a rough coat, had a tight-fitting cap, and held 2 coils of nylon rope in his arms. "We're looking for John Fenwick," Frank announced. "That's me," the man said with a smile. "We're interested in your pigeons," Joe said. Mr. Fenwick laughed and remarked, "You're about 2 years too late for that. As you can see from the perches in the lawn, I switched my interest to falconry." "We have a peregrine falcon," Joe replied. "That's the reason we came to talk to you. Our falcon brought down a pigeon, and we were trying to find the owner so we could settle the account." "Fine attitude, son," Mr. Fenwick declared. "Since you're interested in the birds yourself, you might like to come along with me today. I'm going to Cliff Mountain to get a young hawk from its nest I've been observing." Frank and Joe were thrilled at the idea. Frank suggested that Mr. Fenwick put his gear in the car and let them drive to Cliff Mountain. He accepted, and as they drove along, he explained that he was particularly interested in peregrines. "I spotted one of their nests out in the mountain, and I've been watching the falcon. The eggs have been hatched now. There are 4 of them. I'll take only one little hawk out of the nest and leave the rest to fly away and raise broods of their own. The parent birds will return next year to nest again." When he and the boys arrived at Cliff Mountain, Frank parked the car and Mr. Fenwick led the way up the trail to the location that had given the mountain its name. The going was rugged, but the Hardys, enthusiastic for the hawk and adventure, spurred them on. When they reached the edge of the shady cliff, Mr. Fenwick tied a heavy rope around a sturdy oak, which seemed to be growing out of the rock. The loose end of it was dropped over the side of the cliff. Its entire 100 yards and 25 feet hung down. "Usually," Mr. Fenwick explained, "it's a good idea to have a rope that will reach all the way to the bottom of the cliff. Then, if you can't climb back up to the top safely, you can at least get to the ground without injury. But this cliff is too high for that. No alternative but to come back up." Mr. Fenwick went over the edge of the cliff. He lowered himself about 60 feet, then called to the boys. "There are 3 fledglings. 1 egg didn't hatch. The mother hawk must not be inside." But Mr. Fenwick wasn't taking any chances and called up again, "Keep your eyes open for the mother. She's likely to resist an invasion of her nest. I don't want any trouble if I can't help it. I've been attacked before, and that's no fun." A few minutes later, Mr. Fenwick announced that he had one of the young birds in his sack and was coming up. He signaled to be lifted to the rim. As he came over the edge and the rest of the line was pulled up, Mr. Fenwick said, "Funny, I haven't seen any signs of the tercel either. Usually he'll be hunting for the food for the young. Then the falcon will take the quarry from him in midair, pluck it, and feed the fledglings. Do you think someone might have shot the tercel, and the falcon is getting the food?" Frank asked. "That's possible," Mr. Fenwick replied. "And she will have to do all the work herself until the young can fly." Then the hawk hunter displayed the fledgling. The falcon's tail and wing feathers were short because the bird was so young. Small tufts of down clung to them. The bird's feet were light greenish-gray instead of the brilliant orange of the adults. Both Frank and Joe noticed how large the feet were. They were already fully grown, even though his feathers were still developing. The thing that amazed them most was that the young falcon was brownish-black instead of the black-blue like their own hawk. Mr. Fenwick explained that the young bird never has have the same color and markings as the adults. Next spring, this bird will begin to molt, that is, drop all her old feathers and grow new ones. Those will be her adult feathers, and they'll look like your peregrines. Is that true for all hawks? Joe asked. Yes, said Mr. Fenwick as he put the fledgling back into his pack and began the return journey. When he reached Mr. Fenwick's home, the falconer extended a cordial invite to return soon. Back at their own home, they found Sam Riley waiting for them. He was seated in the garden with Mrs. Hardy and Aunt Gertrude. The falcon sat on the perch beside them. As Riley began his report, the two women arose and went in the house. No one returned for the hunting lodge, he said, and I doubt that anyone will, since they'll figure it's being watched. But I was leaving Smith's woods. I met Mrs. Morton. She told me that Mrs. Smith's lawyer informed her that the property was leased for the summer to a dark-skinned man by the name of Sutter. I have a feeling that he's one of our Indian boys. Frank and Joe agreed. At that moment, a special delivery letter arrived for the boys from the Mediterranean line. It stated that no Indians had arrived on any of their vessels' recent trips to New York. This information may interest you, however, the letter went on. A couple of years ago, there was an Indian member of the Continental crew named Bangalore. He jumped ship. This company is particularly disturbed because the immigration authorities held us responsible for such things. As he folded the letter, Frank read, I wonder if we could get a telegraph of Bangalore. I'll try to locate one, Riley offered. Frank then told him of the clue about the pigeon farrier using the name. It's that name again, John. Bagnev. Oh, man, I can't do this. And the boys decided to phone Mr. Delay. Joe put in a call, but there was no answer at Mr. Harper's home, where the man was staying. Anything more I can do for you, boys? Riley asked. I'll come to keep an eye on the lodge. Frank and Joe could think of nothing else. They mentioned Kane shadowing the Daisy K crew, and that they expected a report from him soon. And I think he should talk to the Coast Guard, Frank remarked. I did that while I was waiting for you, Riley said. The local men have found nothing suspicious on boats or ships in the area they covered. Of course, they don't go out far beyond the 12-mile limit. Does that suggest anything to you? You bet it does, Joe spoke up. For one thing, it seems to back up our idea that a larger ship anchored off-coast receives some sort of signal, or maybe sends its own message by carrier pigeon. Then the smugglers' Indians are taken off the boat, like the motor dory we trailed last night. But we couldn't get the Coast Guard to fly out there and spot any such transfers, Frank pointed out. When the dory reaches our waters, it could have been nabbed. I suppose they might, Riley agreed, but if the smuggled Indians swam a distance from the large ship to the smaller boat at night, the Coast Guard sure would have trouble spotting them. And it is possible for some to cover every bit of the shoreline at once, Frank added, especially at night when a dory could slip in. It might even be that the aliens swim the last half-mile. After Riley left, Frank and Joe talked over their next move. I suggest that we use Mrs. Peregrine for the sleuthing, Frank said. How? Let's take the Falcon out to the Morton's farm and have George Simon meet us there with his copter. Let's take a short wave for us there, then to the airport, and maybe Chet would like to go along. We'll go up in the copter and keep watch for the pigeons coming in from the ocean and heading south. If we spot one, we'll follow it until the bird starts down to her coat. Then We'll turn the falcon loose and let her trail the bird right to its coat. That's the way we ought to be able to intercept any messages it may be carrying." "You mean we'll kill 2 clues with 1 bird?" Joe said, grinning. "First, Frank phoned Chet, who said, 'Count me in. I'd sure like to go along.' Then Frank called George Simons, who agreed to meet them at the farm in half an hour. Joe got the Hawk equipment, hooded and wristed her, and the boys drove off. When they reached the farm, the helicopter was already settled in the open area beyond the barn. The boys headed for it to tell Simon their plans. Chet, seeing them from the kitchen window, came outside and followed them. As he ambled past the corner of the barn, a masked figure moved up behind him. Chet's arms were pinned behind his back, and his hands were clamped over his mouth. In a low, fierce whisper, the masked man ordered, "Bring the falcon to your barn, and leave it there. If you don't, you and the Hardys will be in serious trouble. And don't tell anyone why you're doing it." Desperately, Chet squirmed and twisted in the grasp of his assailant, but could not free himself.